Imagine waking up one morning and your neighbor is dead. You walk outside and the man across the street is dead. You go to the market and half the vendors aren't there, not because they're late. Because they died in the night. By evening, your own arm has a swollen black lump the size of an egg. By tomorrow, you might be gone too. This wasn't a nightmare. This was Europe. 1347 to 1353. 6 years. And in those 6 years, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died. No one is exactly sure of the number because there weren't enough survivors left to count the dead. This is the story of the Black Death, the single most catastrophic event in human history. More deadly than both world wars combined. More deadly than any famine, any earthquake, any tsunami. A disaster so complete that it reshaped the entire civilized world, and whose echoes we still feel today. This is how it started. This is how it spread. This is how it killed. And this is how, barely. Humanity survived To understand just how catastrophic the Black Death was, you need to understand what Europe looked like before it arrived. It's the early 1300s. Europe is booming. The population has nearly tripled over the last 3 centuries. Cities are growing. Trade routes are expanding. Paris, London, Florence, Constantinople, these are thriving, living, breathing metropolises. Cathedrals are being built. Universities are being founded. Art is flourishing. There is a genuine sense that the world is getting better. But beneath all of this progress, there is rot. And not just metaphorical rot, actual, physical rot. Because medieval European cities are, by modern standards, absolutely filthy. There is no sewage system. Waste, human and animal, is dumped directly into the streets. Rats are everywhere. Fleas are everywhere. People bathe rarely, sometimes only a few times a year. Water sources are contaminated. A minor cut can kill you. A bad winter can starve an entire village. The average life expectancy in 14th century Europe is around 35 to 40 years. Infant mortality is staggering. Disease is constant. People are used to death, but the death they know is slow, grinding, ordinary. A sick child here. A fever there. Old age taking a farmer at 50. Nothing has prepared them, nothing could have prepared them, for what is coming. Meanwhile, thousands of miles to the east, in the grasslands of Central Asia, something has already begun. The exact origin of the Black Death is still debated by historians and scientists today. But the most widely accepted theory is that it originated somewhere in the region around modern-day Kyrgyzstan or northwestern China, sometime in the 1330s or early 1340s. Researchers have found archaeological evidence, mass graves with headstones that specifically mention pestilence, dated to 1338 and 1339 near Issyk-Kul Lake in Central Asia. The bacteria responsible, Yersinia pestis, has been identified in the teeth of skeletons buried in those graves. Yersinia pestis is a remarkable and terrifying organism. It is a bacteria that lives in the bloodstream of rodents, particularly wild rodents like marmots and gerbils on the Central Asian steppe. These animals have evolved a partial resistance to it. They carry it. They spread it. But it doesn't kill them quickly. The problem is the flea. Fleas feed on infected rodents. The bacteria multiplies inside the flea's digestive tract, eventually blocking it completely. When a blocked flea bites another animal, or a human, it can't actually swallow the blood it's drinking. So it regurgitates. And in that regurgitation, it pumps Yersinia pestis directly into the bloodstream of its new host. In humans, Yersinia pestis is catastrophic. The immune system has no defense against it. The bacteria moves rapidly to the lymph nodes, the small glands in your armpits, groin, and neck that are part of your body's filtering system, and begins to multiply there at an uncontrollable rate. The lymph nodes swell. They fill with bacteria, dead immune cells, and fluid. They become hard, blackened, agonizing lumps called buboes. This is where we get the name, the bubonic plague. From the Latin bubo, meaning groin or swelling. But the bubonic form is only one way this disease works. And in some ways, it's not even the worst. The Mongol Empire had, ironically, made the world smaller. Under Mongol rule, the Silk Road, the vast network of trade routes connecting China to the Mediterranean, was safer and more traveled than it had ever been. Goods, ideas, and people moved across thousands of miles of steppe and desert with relative ease. And now, so did disease. Yersinia pestis moved along the trade routes, carried in the fur and grain sacks of merchants, in the bodies of rats who stowed away on horses and camels, and in the fleas who traveled with all of them. It crept westward through Central Asia, into Persia, into the Middle East. By 1346, it had reached the Crimean Peninsula, a critical trading hub on the northern shore of the Black Sea, where Genoese merchants operated a major trading post called Kaffa. And here is where history records one of its most extraordinary moments. Kaffa was under siege by a Mongol army led by a commander named Yani Beg. The siege had been going on for years. And then, the plague arrived in the Mongol camp. It began killing soldiers by the thousands. The siege was falling apart. According to the account of the Italian notary Gabriele de Mussis, who wrote about this event shortly afterward, Yani Beg made a decision that would change the world. He ordered his men to catapult the plague-infected corpses of dead soldiers over the walls of Kaffa. Whether this is fully accurate as a historical account is debated. But what is not debated is this: the plague was inside Kaffa. The Genoese merchants inside the city, terrified, watching their own people die, fled. They boarded their ships. They sailed west across the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean. And they took the plague with them. In October 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. When the harbor officials came to meet them, they found most of the sailors already dead. The ones still alive were covered in black swellings oozing blood and pus. They were burning with fever. They were delirious. The authorities of Messina ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately. But it was too late. The plague was already ashore. Within weeks it was in ports across Sicily. Within months it had reached mainland Italy. By 1348, it was in France, Spain, Portugal, England, Germany, and Scandinavia. By 1350, it had reached Poland, Russia, and the Baltic states. It moved with terrifying speed, roughly a mile a day on average, but it didn't move in a smooth line. It jumped. It leaped from port to port along trade routes. It skipped some regions and devastated others. It would hit a city, kill a third of its population in weeks, and then vanish, only to return months later. It followed the roads. It followed the rivers. It followed the ships. And wherever it went, it killed. The Black Death was not one disease in one form. It was at least two, possibly three, distinct clinical presentations of the same bacterial infection, each one terrifying in its own way. The first and most common was the bubonic plague. This is what most people picture when they think of the Black Death. The bacteria enters the body through a flea bite and travels to the nearest lymph node. Within 1 to 7 days, the victim develops a high fever, chills, headache, and extreme weakness. Then the bubo appears, a swollen, blackened, egg-sized or larger lump in the groin, armpit, or neck. These buboes were described by contemporaries in extraordinary detail because they were so unmistakable. A Florentine writer named Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague and wrote about it in the introduction to his famous book The Decameron, described them as tumors in the groin or armpit, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. The pain was described as unbearable. The buboes would sometimes burst, releasing foul-smelling fluid. Internal bleeding could cause dark blotches to appear under the skin, another reason the disease came to be called the Black Death. Without treatment, the bubonic plague kills roughly 30 to 60% of its victims. Death comes within 3 to 7 days. In the 14th century, there was no treatment. Death rates were almost certainly higher. But the bubonic form requires a flea to transmit it from person to person. That's relatively slow. The second form was far more efficient at spreading. The pneumonic plague occurs when Yersinia pestis infects the lungs. This can happen when a person breathes in the bacteria, perhaps from coughing near an infected person, or from handling infected material. In pneumonic plague, the bacteria destroys lung tissue rapidly. The victim coughs up blood. They drown in fluid as their lungs fill. The death rate from untreated pneumonic plague is close to 100%. And unlike bubonic plague, it spreads through the air. Coughing. Breathing. Simply being in the same room. The third form, septicemic plague, occurs when the bacteria enters the bloodstream directly. It causes massive internal bleeding, organ failure, and blackening of the extremities as blood flow is cut off. Victims could die before buboes even had time to form. They went to bed healthy and were dead by morning. Contemporary accounts speak of people who were perfectly fine at breakfast and dead by dinner. This was not metaphor. This was septicemic plague. No description I can give you will fully capture what it was like to live, and die, through the Black Death. But the accounts that survived are vivid enough to give us some sense. Agnolo di Turra del Grasso was a chronicler in Siena, Italy. He wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another. For this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died. And none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices." He also wrote, "And I, Agnolo di Turra, called the fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands." Let that sink in. 5 children. With his own hands. Because there was no one else left to do it. Giovanni Boccaccio described Florence in 1348 with remarkable clarity. He wrote of dead bodies lying in the streets, of pigs who sniffed at the abandoned belongings of plague victims and immediately fell over dead, of the complete breakdown of social order. People abandoned their families. The sick were left to die alone. The dead were stacked like firewood. In some cities, there were so many bodies that they couldn't be buried individually. Mass graves were dug. Bodies were thrown in, layer after layer, covered with a thin layer of dirt, then more bodies on top. Some of these mass graves have been found by archaeologists, and they are enormous, hundreds of bodies interred together. In Paris, the death toll was so high that the city ran out of consecrated ground. The Church of the Holy Innocents, which had a large cemetery, began stacking bodies in charnel houses, buildings specifically built to store the bones of the dead. At its peak, the Parisian cemetery was receiving 800 bodies a day. In Avignon, the seat of the Pope at this time, the death toll was so overwhelming that Pope Clement VI consecrated the Rhône River so that bodies could simply be thrown into it rather than requiring individual burial. The Rhône River became a river of the dead. One of the most striking things about the Black Death is who it killed. It did not discriminate by wealth or status in the way later diseases sometimes did. The King of France's daughter died. The Queen of Aragon died. The Archbishop of Canterbury died. Knights, nobles, bishops, professors, dead. But the poor suffered most. They always do. They lived in more crowded conditions, with more contact with rats and fleas. They had worse nutrition, weaker immune systems, less ability to flee. The wealthy could, and often did, flee infected cities for their country estates. The poor stayed. Entire villages were wiped out. In England, historians have documented what are called lost villages. Settlements that simply ceased to exist after the Black Death. The people died. No one came to replace them. The buildings fell. The fields returned to nature. And for centuries, these places were forgotten. Approximately 30 to 60% of Europe's total population died. In some regions, it was worse. Parts of Italy, France, and Spain may have lost 70 or even 80% of their population. The city of Florence, one of Europe's most vibrant and densely populated cities, lost between 60 and 70% of its population in just a few months. Florence in 1347 had roughly 100,000 people. Florence in 1350 had perhaps 30,000. In some monasteries and convents, where people lived in extremely close quarters, sharing meals and prayers and sleeping spaces, the mortality rate was nearly total. The monastery of Kilkenny in Ireland had only one monk survive. He was writing a chronicle of the plague. He wrote this line near the end: "I leave parchment to continue this work, if perchance any man survive and any of the race of Adam escape this pestilence." He was one man. Writing to a future he wasn't sure would exist. Medieval doctors were not stupid people. They were trained, they were observant, and they genuinely tried to understand what they were dealing with. But they had no tools that could help them. Medieval medicine was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a matter of balance between these four fluids. Disease was caused by an imbalance. The cure was to restore balance, through bloodletting, purging, dietary changes, herbal remedies. None of this had any effect on Yersinia pestis. The leading medical institution in Europe, the University of Paris, issued an official report on the cause of the Black Death in 1348. Their conclusion: the plague was caused by a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius that had occurred on March 20, 1345. This astrological event, they argued, had corrupted the air and created a miasma, a cloud of bad air, that caused disease when breathed. The miasma theory was the dominant medical explanation for the plague throughout the epidemic. And it wasn't entirely without logic. People noticed that the disease seemed to spread in clusters, that it was worse in certain places, that it seemed connected to bad smells and filth. They were noticing real correlations. They were just drawing the wrong conclusions. Treatments for the plague included lancing the buboes, cutting them open to drain the fluid. This was agonizing and usually fatal, as it often spread the infection further. Some doctors recommended sitting near fires to counteract the corrupted air. Others recommended rubbing onions, herbs, or dried snake skin on the buboes. Bloodletting was common. So was holding flowers and herbs under the nose. The origin of the old "ring around the rosy" rhyme, though that specific connection is actually disputed by modern folklorists. Some physicians fled entirely. The most famous doctor of the age, Guy de Chauliac, personal physician to the Pope, stayed in Avignon and observed the plague carefully. He himself caught it and survived, which was unusual. He later wrote that the pneumonic form was so contagious that people could catch it simply from looking at the sick. That was wrong medically, but it reflected a genuine observation, that being near the sick meant death. Medical helplessness led to panic. And panic led to something far darker: when people can't explain something, they find explanations anyway. And when people are terrified and dying, those explanations can become very dangerous. Two major social responses to the Black Death stand out in the historical record. One is heartbreaking. One is monstrous. The heartbreaking one first. The flagellants. The flagellant movement began in Germany in 1348 and spread rapidly across Europe. Groups of men, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands, would travel from town to town in solemn processions. They wore white robes with red crosses. They chanted. And twice a day, they would stop in a public place and engage in ritual self-flagellation, whipping themselves and each other with leather straps embedded with iron spikes until the blood ran freely down their backs. The logic was theological. God was punishing humanity for its sins. The only way to stop the punishment was to suffer. To bleed. To show God that you were repentant. If you could suffer enough, perhaps God would relent. The spectacle drew enormous crowds. People wept watching the flagellants. Many joined. At its peak, the movement involved tens of thousands of people across Germany, the Low Countries, France, and England. The Church eventually condemned the flagellants as heretical in 1349. Partly because they were operating outside Church authority. Partly because their theology was unorthodox, partly because their processions were actually spreading the plague by moving infected people from town to town. The monstrous response was the persecution of the Jews. Jewish communities existed throughout medieval Europe, generally living in segregated neighborhoods called ghettos, subject to legal restrictions, periodic violence, and constant suspicion. And now, as the plague raged, a rumor began to spread: the Jews had poisoned the wells. It was completely false. Jews were dying from the plague at the same rate as everyone else. But the rumor spread anyway. And the consequences were catastrophic. Beginning in 1348, Jewish communities across Europe were massacred. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on St. Valentine's Day, 1349, before the plague had even reached the city. In Mainz, 12,000 Jews were killed. In Frankfurt, in Cologne, in cities across the Holy Roman Empire, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed within months. Pope Clement VI issued 2 papal bulls condemning the persecutions, stating clearly that Jews were dying from the plague just like Christians, and that the accusations were false. It didn't stop the massacres. Some Jewish communities in Germany were virtually exterminated. Those who survived fled east into Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, where they would establish the large Eastern European Jewish communities that would persist for centuries until the Holocaust. The Black Death did not create antisemitism in Europe. But it gave that antisemitism a bloody, furious expression at a moment when terror and grief had overwhelmed reason. If the Black Death had only been a demographic catastrophe, it would have been devastating enough. But it was also a spiritual catastrophe. Perhaps the deepest crisis of faith in the history of medieval Christianity. Medieval people lived in a world thoroughly ordered by religion. The Church explained everything. God was just. God was powerful. God protected the faithful. Sin brought punishment, virtue brought reward. The universe was moral. It made sense. And then the plague came. It killed the virtuous and the sinful alike. It killed priests who administered last rites to the dying. It killed monks who prayed all day. It killed children who had no sins to speak of. It killed the righteous with exactly the same indifference with which it killed the wicked. Where was God? Some people, like the flagellants, responded by trying harder. More prayer. More suffering. More piety. But as the plague continued, as the dead piled up, as God seemed not to intervene, a deep psychological fracture began to appear in European Christianity. Others responded with nihilism. Boccaccio describes this in the Decameron. People who decided that, since death was coming anyway, they might as well enjoy themselves. They threw parties. They drank. They committed what the Church would have called every kind of sin. If God was going to kill you, why be good? The moral order had collapsed. And the institutional Church itself had been catastrophically weakened. A third to half of all clergy had died. Many surviving priests had fled their parishes. The Church's reputation, never entirely uncontested, was now in serious question. If the clergy died at the same rate as everyone else, what did that say about their special relationship with God? Survivors needed clergy to conduct funerals, to hear confessions, to administer last rites. There weren't enough. Standards dropped. Uneducated, poorly trained men were ordained in emergency. This led to corruption, to theological sloppiness, to a general decline in the quality of pastoral care. The seeds of the Protestant Reformation, which would tear European Christianity apart 150 years later, were planted in part by the Black Death. The crisis of faith it created, the corruption it accelerated, the questioning of church authority it provoked, these would grow slowly for generations before exploding in the 16th century. You might expect an event that killed half the population to simply destroy civilization. And in many ways, it came close. But the economic aftermath of the Black Death was stranger and more complex than simple collapse. In the short term, the devastation was total. Fields lay unplanted. Trade ground to a halt. Cities were ghost towns. Banks failed. Supply chains, medieval as they were, broke down completely. But something unexpected happened in the years after the worst of the plague passed. The survivors inherited everything. Think about what it means when a third to half of the population dies. There is suddenly a massive surplus of land, of goods, of housing. People who had been landless peasants found themselves with more land than they could farm. Prices for labor shot up dramatically, because there weren't enough workers. Serfs, peasants who were legally bound to the land and their lords, suddenly had something they had never had before: bargaining power. If a lord treated his serfs too harshly, they could simply leave. They had options. There was land elsewhere. Other lords were desperate for workers. In England, this labor shortage led to serious social upheaval, including the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, in which thousands of English peasants marched on London demanding an end to serfdom and reforms to the legal system. The Black Death didn't end feudalism overnight. But it severely weakened it. The feudal contract, in which peasants gave labor and military service to lords in exchange for protection, depended on a surplus of poor people with no alternatives. The plague eliminated that surplus. Wages rose. The purchasing power of ordinary people increased. In some places, living standards for survivors, cruel as it is to say, actually improved significantly in the decades after the plague. The Italian Renaissance, that extraordinary explosion of art, science, philosophy, and culture that began in Florence in the late 14th and 15th centuries, occurred in a city that had lost more than half its population. Some historians argue the connection is direct: the concentration of wealth among survivors, the collapse of old hierarchies, the psychological need to affirm life and human possibility after so much death, all contributed to the creative explosion that followed. Death gave birth to rebirth. That is the terrible paradox at the heart of the Black Death's legacy. One of the most important things to understand about the Black Death is that it didn't end in 1353. The plague came back. It came back in 1361, a wave so severe that it was called the pestilence of the children, because the first wave had killed so many adults that it was now primarily children, born after 1348, with no exposure-based immunity, who died. It came back in 1369. And in 1374. And in 1390. And in dozens of waves over the next 3 centuries. The plague became endemic in Europe, a recurring nightmare that no generation would entirely escape. In 1665, the Great Plague of London killed roughly 100,000 people, about a quarter of London's population. The Great Fire of London the following year, ironically, may have actually helped end that outbreak by destroying the radon-infested buildings of the old city. The Third Great Plague pandemic began in China in the 1850s and spread globally in the late 19th century, eventually killing approximately 12 million people, mostly in India. And Yersinia pestis has not gone extinct. It still exists. Cases of bubonic plague still occur today, particularly in parts of Africa, Asia, and the American Southwest, where infected fleas occasionally bite humans. In 2017, Madagascar experienced a significant outbreak with over 2,000 cases. In 2019, a couple in Mongolia died of plague after eating raw marmot meat. The difference is that today we have antibiotics. Yersinia pestis is treatable with common antibiotics, streptomycin, gentamicin, doxycycline, if caught early enough. What was once a death sentence is now a manageable infection. But had those antibiotics not existed, had someone in a connected, globalized world of the 21st century released or encountered Yersinia pestis without any medical countermeasures. The result could still be terrifying. The bacteria that killed half of Europe in 5 years has not changed very much. What has changed is us, our medicine, our sanitation, our understanding of how disease spreads. We should not be arrogant about that. We should be grateful and cautious. For centuries, the cause of the Black Death was debated and unknown. People blamed bad air. They blamed astrological conjunctions. They blamed Jews. They blamed God. They blamed sin. The actual answer didn't come until 1894, when a French-Swiss bacteriologist named Alexander Yersin, working in Hong Kong during the third pandemic, isolated the bacteria responsible. He described it and identified it as the cause of plague. The bacteria was later named Yersinia pestis in his honor. In 1898, a French physician named Paul-Louis Simon demonstrated that plague was transmitted by fleas on rats, completing the chain. Rats carried the bacteria. Fleas fed on infected rats. Fleas bit humans. Humans died. With that understanding, control became possible. Kill the rats. Control the fleas. Quarantine the sick. The tools of modern public health, isolation, sanitation, vector control, could finally be deployed effectively. But here's what is astonishing. In 2011 and in subsequent years, researchers used ancient DNA techniques to confirm beyond reasonable scientific doubt that Yersinia pestis was in fact the cause of the Black Death. They extracted DNA from the teeth of plague victims buried in mass graves across Europe and identified the bacterial genetic material. Not only that, they traced the specific strain of Yersinia pestis that caused the Black Death and found that it was the ancestor of virtually all modern strains of the bacteria. The Black Death plague was the evolutionary origin point. The bacteria that killed half of Europe in the 14th century spread, evolved, and diversified. Its descendants are still circulating in the world today. History is never as distant as we think. The Black Death changed everything. That is not hyperbole. It is the considered judgment of historians who have spent their careers studying the period. It changed European demography profoundly. Europe's population did not recover to pre-plague levels until the 16th or 17th century, more than 200 years later. That's how catastrophic the losses were. It changed the relationship between the living and death in European culture. The dance of death, a genre of art depicting death leading people of all social classes in a procession, became ubiquitous in the decades after the Black Death. Skulls. Skeletons. Images of mortality that would seem morbid to us appeared on church walls, in illuminated manuscripts, in public spaces. This was a society processing collective trauma on an enormous scale, and it expressed that trauma in art. It changed language. The word quarantine comes from this era, from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, the period ships were required to wait in harbor before passengers and crew could come ashore, to ensure they weren't infected. The concept of quarantine, of isolating sick individuals from the healthy, was developed directly in response to the Black Death and has been a cornerstone of public health ever since. It changed medicine. Not immediately, medieval medicine remained largely ineffective for centuries. But the need to understand and combat the plague eventually drove the development of empirical observation, of anatomical study, of the scientific method as applied to disease. The plague was part of what forced European medicine to slowly, painfully, begin evolving toward evidence-based practice. It changed agriculture. Labor shortages led to innovation. With fewer workers available, lords and landowners began investing in labor-saving technology. The replacement of human labor with animal power and eventually mechanical power was accelerated by the demographic catastrophe of the plague. It changed religion. The crisis of faith it provoked, the institutional weakening of the church, the psychological shock of living through mass death, all of these contributed to the religious upheaval of the 15th and 16th centuries. And it changed ordinary human life in ways we still take for granted. The European tradition of washing hands before eating. The laying out of bodies before burial. The wearing of black at funerals. The custom of ringing church bells to mark death. The practice of sending flowers, originally to mask the smell of death and disease. These are all habits, customs, and practices that were shaped or intensified by centuries of plague. We are, in ways we rarely think about, products of a civilization forged in the experience of mass death. In the spring of 2020, as COVID-19 spread across the world and governments began implementing lockdowns and quarantines, the word plague was everywhere. People compared the pandemic to the Black Death. Some of those comparisons were exaggerated. COVID-19, devastating as it was not the Black Death. The mortality rates were not comparable. But the responses were hauntingly familiar. The denial in the early days. The scapegoating of outsiders. The flight of the wealthy from cities. The breakdown of normal social rituals, not being able to gather with the dying, not being able to hold funerals. The economic disruption. The search for someone to blame. The desperate reaching for explanations. And the incredible human capacity to survive, to adapt, to help each other, and ultimately to endure. The Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people. It ended civilizations as people had known them. It killed parents and children, priests and kings, scholars and farmers. It drove people to madness and to cruelty and to great acts of courage and compassion. And humanity survived it. Not easily. Not without lasting damage. Not without transforming everything about the world in the process. But we survived. The gravediggers who buried hundreds of strangers when no one else would. The doctors who stayed even when medicine could do nothing. The chroniclers who wrote it all down so that future generations would know what had happened. The ordinary people who kept farming, kept building, kept having children, kept living even when death was at their door every single morning. They survived for us. And we carry their survival forward. The Black Death is not merely a historical event. It is a reminder. A brutal, unforgettable one, of what disease can do when it meets a world unprepared. It is a testament to the fragility of civilization and to the extraordinary stubbornness of human beings in the face of catastrophe. And somewhere in a burrow on the steppe of Central Asia, in the flea that rides the rat that carries the bacterium that has been circling the world for 7 centuries, the story is not entirely over. It is simply waiting.